Hi there, I'm Shulamit,
Hi, I'm Nicole.
and this is the Business Therapy Center Live.
Welcome. It's good to have you
Hey.
here. Hey, Sheila.
Yeah,
Good to see you.
it's fun to be together.
It is.
Yeah.
So, we are going to be talking about some thoughts that we have regarding the label or title,
hmm
trauma informed. We are seeing a lot of people in the online space in particular using trauma informed as part of their marketing or part of the title that they're using for themselves. And we wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what does that actually mean and how are people using it and what our thoughts are about that.
Yes, I have a kitty on my lap
Yay!
and thoughts about that as well. I actually feel quite alarmed. Like I'm noticing just in my chest here, I feel like kind of a heaviness and also like a bit of some kind of like sensation across the top of my chest that's difficult to describe, and I won't waste our time with that right now. And also like a little slightly nauseous, slightly kind of butterfly-y
Mm-hmm.
feeling in my stomach around um this trend. uh and that's I share your concern about it. And this is like I'm sharing this because this is mainly where I'm coming from about this, is out of concern
Mm-hmm.
um for the potential of harm,
Mm-hmm.
really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this isn't a gotcha. It is, we're concerned, if, and rightly so.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, it does seem to be a trend. And I think that you and I have been around long enough, not even just in the therapeutic place, but also from an online business space, to see trends come and go, um, that use this type of you want to call it a pain point or a little a little bruising moment on someone.
Or some kind of appeal, some kind of marketing appeal, some kind
Yeah.
of like call.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it is a trend that we're seeing and have recognized increasing. First when I first saw it, I'm like, well, damn. And then I looked at it, I saw it more and more, and I wanted to understand like how are they defining this? What does trauma informed even mean? And then I started seeing people saying that they were certified. I'm like, well, what does that mean? And as I read, the book by Dr. Bruce Perry, even in the industry, there's a lot of different definitions about what trauma informed even means. And he said, well, I can't give you a direct definition because we can't agree upon it in our own, academic settings. So I'm like, so
Yeah.
how do they know what trauma informed is? So it is alarming. And you're right, it is because of the potential for harm, not to be gatekeeping a title.
Yes. And I'm just keeping notes here because as we refer to things, I'm going to go back after the live and put what we refer to in the comments section. So if anybody's especially you, Nicole, because we're here
Mhm.
together, if you're wondering like,
Yeah.
what is she doing? Is she paying attention? I'm
Yeah.
just taking notes. Um, so yeah, it's like let's talk about that right off the top, because this idea of who the fuck are we to be like having this conversation in the first place, because it could be perceived that we're coming from an interested position as master's level trauma trained and experienced therapists that we are trying to gatekeep. um so what would you like to say about that?
Well, I mean, one thing I would like to say is I certainly would prefer to go to, a surgeon who has training and expertise in that particular skilled uh, treatment and therapy.
Yeah.
I don't think a surgeon's trying to gatekeep their knowledge, and that so there's that. But it's also that it's this is not something that you can learn overnight. It takes years of experience in holding space for people who are in trauma, right? Because if you are saying that you are trauma informed and you are attracting people to work with you because of that, people are in trauma when they are working with you.
Yeah.
right? And there's a particular set of skills and tools needed to be able to hold space and do minimal harm, because there's no doing no harm, with people who are in trauma. And so I don't know so much it's gatekeeping as it is calling for accountability, integrity, and also transparency about your training and the frameworks and tools that you're using.
Yeah. I really like what you said just as you started about how, like, a surgeon, right? Like, you don't go to a foot surgeon for cancer. If that's actually straight up going to cause harm, you could possibly die.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because the person who's taking care of your feet he's going to understand your organism as a whole and how the feet are connected, but he's not going to necessarily get the intricacies of cancer, which is quite a specialized and complex illness. And so too, for psychological stuff, trauma is very complex. Like when I think about my master's training, I went back to school late in life. It was something I wanted. I'm very proud of having been able to do it under yes, I have privilege, and it was hard for me, even with that privilege, to do it. But when I think about the training that I had coming out of that program, like, it was just basic. Our first year was academic. Our second year was partially academic. And then the other part was clinical placement in a counseling center at the university, where we were assigned clients according to our capacity. Our sessions were recorded. And then we had group supervision afterwards, where we watched our recordings and got feedback. And in addition to that, we also had external placements, where we also had a client load, and we were supervised, and we had to report on every client and what happened in session and be overseen by, and even still, I didn't know shit about trauma coming out. Nothing, nada.
It's nothing. Same. It's having that supervision. We were doing, having sessions recorded, doing role play, all the things. And this was for an extended amount of time, and also having placement in a real environment, with that mentoring and supervision on all things, because trauma is in the middle of everything, right? So you're dealing with, depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use disorders, all of it. Trauma is right in the middle of all of it. So, so it takes a lot of time to then be in the experience of being in the room with someone and knowing how to attend to what might come up for them, because you just never know.
Yeah.
And so that takes time. It takes experience. It takes oversight. It takes supervision. It takes accountability. It takes circling back. It takes learning new skills. And even as someone who, I have a master's degree in social work. I went through a license, a clinical track. I went to a school that had a clinical program because I knew I wanted to be a therapist.
Clinical meaning direct work with people.
Direct work with people with the intention of being in a therapeutic setting in some kind.
Like, as opposed to like a hospital or navigating systems or whatever. This is like psychotherapy. Yeah.
Exactly. So even with that, like, everything was geared towards being in a therapeutic setting as a therapist. And, even so, it's not the same as having that life experience, working with people directly. And, I missed my train of thought. But anyway, so basically what we're saying is that it takes time to build that skill. Oh, and even as someone who has all of that training and all that credentialing, I still don't feel like I am a trauma therapist expert by any stretch. There's still so much that is evolving through the research of trauma that I am catching up with myself. And I'm not trained in EMDR, like these really specific therapeutic trauma interventions that people have gone on to specialize in and spend years doing. I don't have that advanced training. So if someone came to me with PTSD, I would refer to someone that specialty with a very specific skill set that they can bring to the table. So, even myself, I want to say, like, I'm still not the person that I would say is the expert on trauma. And I have questions.
Questions. Yeah. So for me, what made what how I see my trauma trained, like the empowerment that I received to work with trauma, was that I worked in a setting that was exclusively working with survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence.
Mhm.
That was the setting. Those were the people I worked with. That was what I was supervised to do. And in addition, I took formal training and certification in trauma, in a particular style of trauma, two particular styles of trauma treatment.
Mhm.
But as you say, there are things aspects of trauma treatment in which I am not trained, and aspects of trauma in which I am not trained, because it is such a complex field. So, for example, there are some aspects of dissociation that I am trained to work with, but dissociation occurs along a spectrum, right along to dissociative identity disorder, which is what we would call the most extreme or the most manifest example of dissociation. That's outside my scope of practice. And one of the things there are so many things I don't like about our field and about regulation, but to I'm just gonna I got distracted by a comment, so I'm gonna pause and regroup. Yes, and so scope of practice is something that I appreciate, the concept of scope of practice, because it helps me know where my skill stops. And that's part of the training that we receive. In the training, we're taught that this is where you have to stop, and you do have to refer, because it's outside of what you're trained to do. And there is a standard within our profession that says if you haven't got, you can't just take a course. You have to actually have a designation, some type of clinical training, formal professional clinical training, before you can call yourself a specialist in X.
Mhm.
And that I'm appreciating that idea of the scope of practice, because it helps me stay in my lane. But also, it recognizes the complexity of trauma treatment and recognizes the idiosyncratic nature of trauma. And so the very wide range of treatments that are available, it's part of our work is to recognize, hey, you know what I do isn't appropriate for what's happening with you, and it's nothing about you, it's about me. And this would work better for you. Let me refer you to this other particular style of trauma treatment, because it works better for you.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's an ongoing process and requires supervision, conversations with peers, checking in with yourself. Like there's a whole list of things that go into that. And we as clinicians, when we get these certifications for these different modalities or different approaches, it's not just information. There is additional training with supervision and, again, mentoring, the use of the tool that you just learned about for the last 3
Right.
days, right?
It's the how to be. It's
Mhm.
the being. It's
Mhm.
not the psychoeducation. Yeah,
Mm-mm.
absolutely.
Exactly. And that takes time.
Yeah.
That takes
Yeah.
time to learn
Yeah.
and someone to guide you through that and to hold space for you to practice it.
Yeah. So, I wouldn't be opposed, coming back to this issue of who the fuck are we anyways, and where do we get off saying what we think, should be or shouldn't be with folks who aren't clinicians. What I long to see is a robust training for folks who are not clinicians, because trauma is ubiquitous.
Mhm.
It's a mundane experience. Many folks come with trauma experiences, and to be able to hold space for those folks is a wonderful gift. And what I would love to see is a really robust kind of training that's less on information and more on engaged practice, role play, and supervision. And
Mhm.
after, let's say, I don't know, I'm just picking something random, like after a year, maybe, of weekly supervision on it, that would be what I would want to see for a service provider, to be
Mhm.
claiming some kind of capacity to support, not to treat trauma, but to
Mhm.
support trauma survivors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree, because there are a lot of people in the helping industry, in the field. There are a lot of people who have the ability to build trust with their clients and our integrity and want to do ethical work.
Right. Yeah.
And the more of us that can support, the better.
Yeah.
without harming.
Yes.
So more people are needed to support when it comes to trauma because it is so pervasive. It's at the intersection of so many of the big problems that we have. And not all the therapists have space for everyone. So I do think that there is a conversation around how could that be more accessible, but also still, ethical and in integrity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd love to see that training too.
Yeah. So maybe we might like to pause and take a breath and kind of think about what more we want to say about this.
Yeah. I think that we had a conversation recently where we talked about what is the difference between trauma informed and
Oh, sure.
trauma training.
Yes.
So
So
maybe we could
important.
do that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I did some research. I looked into, because I'm a social worker, I looked into the social work literature. There is literature in the psychological academic like there's literature on what this means in many of the different professions. And I just want to say that I looked at the social work literature because I'm a social worker. And since at least 2009 in social work circles, there has been talk about trauma-informed care. My understanding of how this evolved is that as healthcare providers, and particularly mental health care and social service providers, became aware of the pervasive nature of trauma in the world, they also became aware of how trauma affected people's behaviors and capacities. And so it first started with, like, for example, in serving settings where social welfare services were provided, where folks are most often the most marginalized folks, are marginalized in this way because of their trauma experiences. They've grown up in generational trauma, intergenerational trauma, poverty, abuse, all that kind of stuff, right? So you have a person like this who comes into a social service setting and something doesn't go their way. How they respond comes out of their, it is more likely to come out of their trauma response, their defensiveness, or their fear. And they behave in ways that externally appears like aggressive, abusive, angry, uncooperative. And folks began to understand that where these were really trauma responses, and how could we mitigate this so that we could actually, because these trauma responses, blaming the people for these responses, block their ability to access care. People would be like, no abusive behavior here, out the door. You can't have our services. And that was just another barrier, right? And so the way it came in was for folks to be able to understand and how to de-escalate and send messages of safety and comfort to the folks so that their trauma responses could kind of downgrade a little bit, so that they could then, behave, engage in more cooperative behaviors with the people who are providing services. And I think that was fantastic because it eliminated a barrier. It wasn't trauma care per se. It wasn't treatment of their trauma. It was just recognizing how trauma stuff can be a barrier and how to eliminate that barrier. So that's where it started. And so the concept of trauma-informed care meant that folks were empowered to understand and consider how trauma was pervasive, and how to promote an environment of support and healing and recovery for folks who are trauma survivors, rather than perpetuating the harm, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So they knew that trauma is likely to show up in such and such a way, and if it did, how to respond. Not how to treat the client, not how to tell the client what was happening with them, but actually how to behave human to human in a way that created more safety.
Yes.
And then it became more and more of a clinical issue as the trauma research came up, and it became more formal trainings entered in, like you say, like the EMDR and some of the other recognized trauma treatments. Mm-hmm. So there's like a spectrum of knowledge around trauma, let's say, that appropriately fits each of the players in the picture. Mm-hmm. From the receptionist answering the phone right through to the clinician.
Exactly.
and it's appropriate to the role. The person answering the phone does not claim to be able to treat trauma, right? And on her resume, she's not going to say trauma-informed telephone answering service.
Right.
She's gonna list her qualifications as a front desk client interface person,
Mm-hmm.
right? Client ambassador or whatever you want to call them.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe in her qualifications, she'll list that she's got this training,
Mm-hmm.
but she's not going to call herself a trauma-informed receptionist, right?
Yeah. 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 The roots of it really do come from a place of, like you said, bringing down a barrier, doing no harm to the person, harm reduction, understanding that it's not personal. I can't tell you how much supervision I did with counselors who thought the person's behavior was personal against them, and I'm like, no, that ain't about you.
It's hard to witness that, right? It's hard to be in a room with that, but it isn't about you. That's right.
It isn't about you, and it takes some time to really understand that, work within that, and be able to sit with that, like physically and emotionally and intellectually. And it takes some space to be able to do that. So,
I want to pull out the point that you just made, because our reactions, like part of being a professional who works with trauma, is we need care for ourselves to be able to unpack all this stuff. Like, what is my reaction? How do I care for my reaction? I need to process that and take care of all that so that I don't bring it back into the room and put it on the person in front of me, which I think to me is such an important aspect of ongoing work with trauma survivors, is to be able to like tease out so that and that's an aspect of not causing further harm, right?
I agree 100%. And that's why my question always is, when I see trauma informed in someone's title, or even a trauma informed certificate, I want to ask them, what does that mean to you? And what kind of supervision are you getting around that as well? Because I think you mentioned before that if you are marketing to trauma as trauma informed, you're going to be attracting people with trauma to work with you, right? And so what is your responsibility there? Because you're putting out a little neon sign, and so you build it, they will come. So at that point, what are you doing to work on doing no harm to yourself as someone who's doing that work, but also to the people who are coming to see you? Like, what supervision, what support are you getting? Because it's so easy when you have someone whose nervous system is dysregulated and they are not able to manage, their emotions or reactions at that moment. It's so easy to make it personal. It's so easy to then go into reaction, and to complicate and escalate the situation.
And not be able to know the difference because you're so activated yourself. Yeah.
Exactly. So when we talk about trauma informed, we're still looking at frameworks and understanding, what does trauma informed mean? Trauma informed would be understanding that many of the people who come before you, if you're a doctor, that have chronic illnesses, that it's very likely that they had childhood trauma, because there's a direct connection between, childhood trauma experiences and physical health issues. When I worked in the field of, substance abuse, it used to really upset me that we were treating people symptomatically as a heroin addict. And I was saying, what are we doing for their trauma? What are we doing for their trauma? What are we doing? And even
addiction is a coping mechanism, right?
Exactly.
And
even within that system, still no acknowledgement of this trauma. So when we think about trauma informed, I think of it as a way to approach, right? When we've talked about what does it mean to be trauma aware, right? Before, regarding, is it trauma informed or trauma aware or trauma trained? So we've kind of talked about what it means to be trauma trained. We've talked about trauma informed. What are your thoughts about trauma aware? What the difference is?
Well, I'll come to that in a second, but there's something I want to pull up from what you said that I think is really, really, really important around the danger of this. That in an environment where therapy is stigmatized, going to a therapist, getting psychotherapy is stigmatized, and trauma is stigmatized.
Mm-hmm.
We see many people going to coaches, and many coaches will say this, that folks come to them who should be going to therapy, but because of the stigma and the difficulties accessing therapy, also many people end up in coaching who really need therapy.
Yeah.
We also parenthetically notice this about yoga teacher trainings, where folks who need therapy, but because of the accessibility of the yoga teacher training, will go there instead of to therapists. And so when you advertise yourself, as you said, as a trauma whatever person, that's going to bring those folks there when really they should be going elsewhere. So what does it, well, to me, there's a spectrum, right? And I'm going to return to the example that I used before of the range of folks who are in an office providing services, right? And so there's the very frontline folks who are really the face of the organization, who really have a lot of day-to-day interaction with people. And it's really focused on like buying groceries, answering the phone, like very straight up a bank teller, just very straight up day-to-day activities, right? And there like trauma shows up at that level. And so to be able to understand, as a service provider of any sort, a bank teller, a phone answering person, like anything, to be aware of how the nervous system shows up in general. I mean, I think this is just basic customer service, good customer service training, how to deal with difficult clients, right? Is to understand about nervous systems, understand about theirs and yours, and understand how to respond in a nervous system positive way. So there's right from the very mundane of like the course of day-to-day activities is on one end of the spectrum, and then right across to the other end of the spectrum is actual process facilitation, training in process facilitation around how to directly address trauma and its impact, because trauma affects brain development. It affects physiology, as you've mentioned. It affects beliefs. It affects behaviors. It is such a complex and far-reaching experience that has a profound impact. Like it shapes us. It really does. And as a trauma survivor, I really want to hold that we are not doomed as trauma survivors. And at the same time, like I want to hold both of these. We are not doomed as trauma survivors. And at the same time, trauma shapes us from very early development right up to the current day.
Yeah.
It shapes us and our world. And when you think about that depth of complexity and impact, then I would want, if somebody is supporting me in addressing how trauma has shaped me so that I can shape myself and my world differently, like post-traumatic growth, so that I can grow into who I really want to be, that person, I want to have very in-depth, extensive training. And I want them also to know, to me, this is the primary thing that I think should go across all levels of trauma training for service providers. Where does your scope of practice end?
Great.
And when to refer? And I would say to err in favor of referring early, because the more cautious you are, the less likely you are to cause harm. Because in the case of trauma, we say slow is fast and less is more.
Yeah.
And to me, like that's the absolute bottom line. And I don't see that line about scope of practice and when to refer. When I've looked through the curriculums of the trauma-informed or whatever certifications for service providers, I don't see that. And that to me is the most alarming thing.
Yeah, I agree, because when we're not aware of how our trauma is showing up, then we are more likely to hang on to that client. We are more likely to feel kind of codependent with their process. If they are paying you, your need for money and survival can cloud your judgment around that
And no
referral
wonder.
process. Yeah.
And no wonder, like, of course, right? And you need to be clear about it.
And you need to be clear about it, because if you are not, the likelihood that you're going to be doing harm to both of you at that point is very, very high.
Yeah.
So, so we still have questions about what does it mean when you say you are trauma informed? What does it mean when you've been through a trauma informed certification? And what is the likelihood that you can hold solid space for yourself and people who are coming to you? Because as you said before, people like to circumvent therapists because of the stigma. So I'll go to a life coach instead, or I'll go see a healer, or I'll go do yoga, or I'll go get trained in Reiki, or whatever that may be. And like all of them, don't have a problem with them. But because of the stigma, is it a way that people will find themselves in these situations where they're working with someone around their trauma who may not be safe for them to do that trauma work with.
As a trauma therapist, my greatest wish is that everybody who came to work with me, now I work with entrepreneurs, and we can address trauma as it shows up in entrepreneurship. Mm. So for my current clients and for my past trauma clients, my greatest wish is that we could have been supported in our work together by a whole team of holistic folks. Reiki, an energy healer, a massage therapist, a life coach, all those things. And my wish would have been that all of the folks on the team would have understood, we all would have understood how trauma shows up and how our nervous systems work and how to care for ourselves as people who are working with trauma survivors, and that we know how to call in the rest of the team. Yeah. So that person is just held in such a rich and lovely circle of care, right? That's, to me, what I would wish as an ultimate outcome for this.
Yeah, I agree, because, top-down trauma work only goes so far. So much of it is about the bottom-up treatment, support around nervous systems, our body, being embodied. And there's so much that talk can't do because a lot of trauma is pre-verbal and doesn't have language attached to it. So, wrapping that person in all these levels of support around healing their trauma, gosh, I think that we would have people through it so much faster and with such a better experience. And what a beautiful result we would have if we had that.
Wouldn't it be beautiful?
Yeah, it makes me really a little emotional.
A little choked up. Yeah.
I think it would be beautiful.
If only we could be fairy godmothers and wave the magic wand.
I know. And so, as we say this, we're not trying to cut people out of the trauma game. We're trying to call people in the appropriate way to do their own work, to be, more in integrity as they're doing this work.
Yeah. Well, we're at the half hour. It seems like a good place to close for today. Does that feel all right for you?
Yeah, I feel like we've had a really good conversation about, what it means to us and what the questions we still have. And maybe we can do another one at some point to talk about what you could do as a consumer when you see this and you're attracted to it, what questions you might need to ask and how to really identify what it is you're truly looking for as well.
Oh, that's awesome. It's a date. That's what our next one's going to be.
Exactly. We can do that.
All right. See you all next time.